So this is a photo of a 1947 housewife. She spent $12.50 to buy all of her family's groceries for the week, but there's a lot more to this story. Hello there, I'm Christina, and you're listening to History and Hearsay. The year was 1947. The United States was still reeling from the effects of the Second World War, and grocery prices were high. And of course, this was a hot topic in the media. Life put out a magazine all about inflation and high prices. In this magazine, they featured a homemaker from Atlanta, Georgia, named Mrs. Hamilton Williams. In this article, Mrs. Williams shared all of her tips and tricks on how she was able to feed her family for only $12.50 a week. She was feeding herself, her husband, their 4-year-old twin daughters, and the family cat, which they made a special point to mention that she was fed well. Also included in Mrs. Williams' grocery budget was the ingredients to make treats for her daughter's school. Now, when this article came out, people were outraged. But before we get to why people were so mad, let's read the article together. So here we have a photo of Mrs. Williams in front of a store, and it says, Mrs. Williams scans shop window for bargains. Then the headline of the article reads, this is how one family eats on $12.50 a week. If all American housewives had the spunk and ingenuity of the woman on this page, Mrs. Hamilton Williams of Atlanta, Georgia, inflation would be less of a swear word. Mrs. Williams, wife of a high school teacher, allows herself $12 a week to buy all of her groceries except milk. On this, she manages to feed herself, her husband, her 4-year-old twins, and even the family cat. The job takes considerable doing. Mrs. Williams is an avid student of grocery ads and shop windows. She limits herself to one shopping expedition a week, at which she weighs every penny against the family's full week appetite. She serves no meat at lunch and limits her evening entrees to such items as meatloaf, hamburgers, and chili. Yet, she manages to provide 2 desserts daily and such frills as cookies for a party. When she described her budget in the Atlanta Journal recently, less enterprising housewives sent in letters of dismay, and the city's CIO got to work on an official denial that any family could eat so cheaply. But Mrs. Williams, the 1947 heroine of the Battle of the Budget, carried merrily on. Then there's a large photo of Mrs. Williams with a bunch of newspapers spread out in front of her, and the caption under that photo says, "Careful shopping by Mrs. Williams starts with a search through grocery advertisements." Then below that, we see the viral photo, which is the one of Mrs. Williams sitting on the floor with all of her groceries laid neatly out so that you can kind of see everything that she bought. And the caption for that photo says, "She proudly displays the results of one of her weekly trips to the stores, $12.50 worth of purchases, which will feed her family of 4 the next 7 days." The wrapped packages in the foreground contain the cheapest available cuts of meat. Then there's another photo on the side which shows Mrs. Williams bent over icing some cookies, and it says, "Cookie baking for a parent-teacher association party at the twins' school also comes out of the budget." And then there's this one final photo at the bottom of the article that shows her 2 twin girls and their cat, and the caption reads, "The Williamses' small food budget includes square meals for the cat." Now, we know that $12.50 doesn't sound like that much money in 2024, but if we put $12.50 into an inflation calculator, it comes out to $172.88 of buying power in 2024, which, depending on where you live, may or may not sound like a pretty decent grocery budget. For me, as someone who lives in the southern part of the United States, I'm personally able to feed myself, my husband, our 4-year-old and 6-year-old, and our dog on an average budget of about $150 a week. Now, I don't achieve this by hunting for sales, couponing, or doing anything extreme. I'm pretty much just mindful of buying store brands. I cook mostly from scratch, and we purchase some things in bulk. Also, we plan to make meals that are large enough so we have leftovers, which also saves us money. So $172 to me sounds pretty reasonable. So why were people so outraged when this article came out? Well, it turns out that groceries in 1947 were much higher even than what we're paying now in 2024 with all the inflation issues we have right now. And It turns out that $12.50 was a pretty extreme budget at that time compared to what most people were spending. So of course, the newspapers and magazines were getting these outraged letters from people saying that this was an impossible budget and there was no way that the average family could live on the budget that Mrs. Williams was saying she maintained. So all of this outrage made me want to dig into this a little deeper. So with the help of an inflation calculator, we're able to get a much clearer perspective of what the 1944 dollar looked like compared to 2024. And this helps us to put things into more of a perspective of what people were actually spending. So the national average of salary in 1947 was around $3,000. But from this article, we know that Mrs. Williams' husband was a school teacher, which meant he made less than the average pay. Same as today. The average teacher's salary in 1947 was $2,589, which is equivalent to $35,806 in 2024. And just to give you guys a quick rundown of what other people made, lawyers made around $7,437, which is $102,856 in today's money. And then doctors made around $10,700, which is around $147,984 in today's money. And then your factory workers made $2,793, which is about $38,628 in today's money. Getting back to the groceries, if you look at the average that people spent on groceries, it says that the typical family spent between $137 and $174 per month, which comes out to between $32.76 and $41.83 per week. So you can see why people would get upset that Mrs. Williams was saying that she could feed her family on $12.50 because that was basically a third of the national averages, even if you go on the low end. It's said that a lot of people during this time were essentially spending about 60% of their income on food, and Mrs. Williams was able to keep hers around 25% of their income. Okay, so if we take the national averages and we put them into today's money, that $32 to $42 price range would be about $470 to $600 per week in 2024 money. So while the prices of everything has gone up currently because of our joke of an administration, we're still way better off than they were in 1947. Just to encourage you guys, if they could make it work, then we certainly can. As Americans in general, we definitely live way more lavish lifestyles, and most of us could do with a lot less than what we think that we need. Now, another thing I wanted to mention to you guys is when I had posted a video about this on TikTok, people were talking about victory gardens, and the gardens that people started during the war whenever it was hard to get fresh produce, like it just wasn't available. I don't think it was ever rationed, but it was something that people just couldn't get their hands on. And a lot of women did start backyard gardens, but apparently by the time the war was over, people just quit doing that. So by 1947, victory gardens probably would not have been a thing. I did watch a great video on this topic that was done by a grocery budgeting channel called Living on a Dime to Grow Rich. I'll link their video below. They go into a lot more detail. I think their video is like an hour and a half long. So if you guys want to check that video out if you're struggling to pay for groceries, because they are definitely an amazing resource. But just to round things out with a few more comparison, I found a few averages for you guys for groceries and things like that. And according to Living on a Dime, in 1947, bread cost 15 cents, which is $2.05 in today's money. For me, I can go to my Walmart and get bread for $1.87. I pulled everything up in the Walmart app just to make sure that my prices are the most current. Butter was 59 cents, which is equivalent to $8.06 in today's money. And I can get butter for like just under $4 at my Walmart. 5 pounds of sugar was 49 cents, which is equivalent to $6.70. My Walmart sells 5 pounds of sugars for $4. Milk was 80 cents, which is equivalent to $8.67. Today for me currently where I live now, a gallon of milk is $2.92. For a dozen eggs back in 1947, it was 59 cents, which is equivalent to $8.06 for a dozen eggs. That makes me think of like a year or two ago when we had all the crazy high prices on eggs. Where I live now currently, a dozen eggs is $2.78. Coffee for 2 pounds of coffee back in 1947 was $1.17, which is equivalent to $15.99. And I just looked at the random Walmart brand and they were all around $9 something to $10 for 2 pounds of coffee. Ground beef was 30 cents a pound, which was about $4.65. The kind that I buy at Walmart, just the tube ground beef is $3.59 a pound right now. If you look at a lot of the other prices, such as housing prices and all of that, some of that will seem cheaper as well, but you look at the fact that they lived in homes that were like a third of the size of the average home now, and you compare it by square footage, prices have actually kind of gone down overall from what they paid in 1947, which is kind of wild if you think about it. So as high as prices might seem right now, here's your encouragement. It could be worse. A lot of times people will be really nostalgic about the past and say, oh, things were easier for them so much. And I feel like every single generation does that to the previous generation, but they're comparing apples and oranges a lot of times. People nowadays think that they deserve a Disney vacation every year. You deserve to go to the beach for 10 days. And guess what? These people weren't doing that. They were spending all of their money on basic necessities. They worked really hard for what they had, and it was the basic essentials, and people were happy. Consumerism in the United States and the Western world has gotten so bad that they've convinced all of us that these luxuries are necessities. Kids graduating from high school and college want what it took their parents 30 years to get. My parents used to tell me that all the time when they were looking at young kids. Now I'm in my mid-30s and I see it and I'm like, yeah, I get what you were saying, Dad. I get what you were saying, Mom. Thank you guys so much for watching today's video. Leave me a comment down below if you have any further questions. And until next time, I'll catch you right here in the next one.